Ilara, an autistic girl, and her stray dog, Shadow, shared a unique and silent bond. But when Shadow began to bark incessantly at the frozen lake, Ilara's parents ignored him, believing it was just anxiety. They didn't know that the dog's keen instinct was the only thing between life and death for the children playing there. The winter sun, a pale, distant disk, barely warmed the layer of ice covering the municipal lake in Springwood. Crystalline laughter echoed through the icy air, carrying a carefree spirit that Shadow's heart seemed unable to tolerate. The stray tugged at Ilara's leash with renewed force, his barks now sharper, almost desperate, a silent plea that no one but the girl seemed to understand. Ilara's parents, seated on a distant bench, exchanged low words, their concern for their daughter and her therapy sessions filling the space they should have dedicated to the dog's warnings. "Shadow, please, quiet down," Ilara's mother said without even glancing at her husband. "He's just agitated, as always." Ilara, with her peculiar sensitivity, felt Shadow's anguish vibrate through the leash. She touched the dog's head, her thin fingers stroking his rough fur, trying to calm him, but knowing in some inarticulate way that calm was not what he sought. Her blue eyes, usually turned inward to a world of their own, were fixed on the lake, where a group of children, including little Gabriel, skated with clumsy, joyful movements. Suddenly, a thunderous sound ripped through the frozen silence. It wasn't the familiar crack of ice under skates, but a deep, terrifying crack, like a fissure opening in the very structure of the world. The children's laughter abruptly ceased, replaced by a loud, hollow plash, followed by a sharp scream, laden with pure terror that echoed through the air, piercing the adults' indifference. Gabriel's body, an instant before floating on the ice, vanished into the dark, icy water. His head quickly resurfaced, eyes wide, body trembling with cold and fear as he struggled desperately against the lake's icy embrace. Other children, paralyzed by horror, pointed at the hole, their voices caught in their throats. Shadow, previously a bundle of anxiety, transformed into an arrow. A deep growl escaped his throat, and he lunged forward, tearing through the air with furious, urgent barks. Unlike anything they had ever heard from him, he was no longer warning, he was acting. He pulled Ilara with such force that she almost fell, but the girl, surprisingly, didn't resist. Her eyes widened, and a muffled sound escaped her lips, as if she had finally found confirmation for something Shadow already knew. Ilara's parents, finally jolted from their bubble of concern, stood up abruptly, blood chilling in their veins. "What was that?" her father asked, his voice hoarse, before even seeing what Shadow already indicated with his desperate run. Their eyes followed the dog's frantic direction, and it was then that panic hit them with the force of a punch. The image of Gabriel struggling in the water, the muffled cries of other children, and the wild urgency in Shadow's barks finally coalesced into a terrible and undeniable truth. "Gabriel!" Ilara's mother cried, the boy's name sounding like a lament. Her father ran, his feet sinking into the snow, his heart pounding wildly. Shadow ahead barked and yelped, running towards the lake, not for Ilara, but for the danger. He was the compass, the unwavering voice they had ignored, and now, desperately, they would follow. Ilara's father, Mr. Mendez, felt the icy air burn his lungs as he ran. The soft snow clung to his shoes, each step a struggle against the slippery terrain, but the image of the neighbor's son, Gabriel, sinking into the dark water, propelled him forward with desperate force. Shadow, a brown and black blur ahead of him, guided the way with intermittent barks and sharp yelps, a dissonant melody of urgency that now sounded like the purest truth. His eyes, previously fixed on Ilara, now aimed at the exact spot where the ice had given way. A dark patch on the white surface, a hole that swallowed innocence. Ilara's mother, Mrs. Mendez, stumbled behind, her heavy coat hindering her run. Her voice still caught in her throat in a knot of dread, but her eyes fixed on her daughter. Ilara didn't cry, didn't scream, but her blue eyes reflected an intensity she rarely showed, a silent understanding that connected her heart to the dog's. She clung to Shadow's leash, not to stop him, but as an extension of her own will, an invisible current that connected her to the animal's frantic action. For Ilara, Shadow wasn't just barking, he was speaking a clear and unequivocal language. As he approached the edge of the lake, Mr. Mendez saw the scene with brutal clarity. Gabriel struggled, his small hands fighting against the ice that prevented him from climbing out. The extreme cold was already beginning to numb his movements, and the child coughed heavily, swallowing gulps of icy water that cut off his breath. Other adults, drawn by the sharp scream of terror and Shadow's desperate barks, began to converge, their faces contorted with horror and apprehension. But no one seemed to know what to do. "Don't get too close!" a man shouted, his voice hoarse and frightened, realizing the fragility of the ice around the hole opening in the surface. Mr. Mendez, however, didn't stop. He knew every second counted, that hypothermia would set in quickly. Shadow, with surprising agility, stopped a few feet from the crumbling edge. The dog crouched, front paws outstretched, body tense and snout pointing. He indicated the safest route, almost as if testing the ice with his own energy. He barked once more, a deep, authoritative bark, pointing to a fallen tree branch near the bank, a trunk strong enough to serve as support or an extension. Mr. Mendez understood the message. His eyes met Shadow's for an instant, and in that look there was a recognition, a mute and immense gratitude. He grabbed the branch, which was more like a thin log, and carefully pushed it over the ice, extending it towards Gabriel. The ice cracked menacingly under the weight of the log and under his own feet, but it didn't give way completely. "Gabriel, grab the branch," he shouted, his voice failing, mixing with the tremor that shook his body. Gabriel, almost out of strength, stretched out a trembling hand. His purple fingers barely managed to grasp the smooth, slippery wood. Mr. Mendez pulled with all his might, feeling the ice groan under his own feet, the fear of falling also a persistent thought. Shadow, in an unexpected move, went to Ilara's father, grabbed his pant leg with his teeth and pulled with impressive force, helping to anchor him and give an extra boost that the man hadn't expected. It was as if the dog knew exactly where and how to apply force. The combined effort, the man's desperate strength and the dog's unexpected but calculated assistance, was enough. With a final pull, Gabriel was dragged out of the water, his body limp and bluish, trembling uncontrollably. Mrs. Mendez ran, tearing off her own coat to wrap the boy, while other adults were already calling emergency services, some already running to fetch warm blankets. Ilara approached, her steps light on the snow, her face expressionless, but her eyes conveying everything. She knelt beside Shadow, who was now panting, but with his eyes fixed on Gabriel, his body relaxed in silent relief. The girl touched the dog's wet fur, an almost inaudible murmur escaping her lips. "You knew, Shadow. You always knew." It was a confirmation, not a question. Mr. and Mrs. Mendez looked at the neighbor's son, then at Shadow, and finally at Ilara. The image of the dog pulling her father's pants, his unquestionable dedication, the way he had warned and guided, now clicked into their minds with painful clarity. They had ignored, minimized, and almost paid a terrible price. Guilt weighed like lead, crushing them, but gratitude was overwhelming, a tsunami of emotions that left them speechless. The incessant barking, the agitation they had dismissed as anxiety, was, in fact, a vital cry for help, an unheard prophecy. Shadow was not just a rescued stray, he was a guardian, a silent prophet, and the unwavering voice they should have listened to from the start. That harsh winter had revealed not only the fragility of the ice, but also the depth of an animal's intelligence and unconditional love. They looked at Ilara, who was still petting Shadow, and saw the truth in her eyes she had always known, and they finally knew too. The icy air still cut their breath, but now it carried the scent of relief and the contained urgency of arriving paramedics. Distant sirens ripped through the frozen silence, approaching rapidly, and adults ran with blankets, panic replaced by a wave of frantic solidarity. Gabriel, small and pale, was carefully wrapped and taken by the professionals, his body still trembling, but his eyes, now open, registering the blurred world around him. Mr. Mendez watched the boy disappear into the ambulance, a sharp pain in his chest that wasn't from the cold, but from guilt and overwhelming gratitude. He turned, eyes watering, and saw Shadow beside Ilara, the girl still stroking the dog's wet fur. Words seemed inadequate, too small for what had happened. He knelt in the snow, not caring about the dampness soaking his pants, and pulled Shadow into a tight hug. The dog, surprised, let out a muffled yelp, but didn't resist, his tail beginning to wag slowly, almost imperceptibly. "My God, Shadow," Mr. Mendez murmured, his voice choked with emotion. We were so foolish, so blind." Mrs. Mendez, who watched the scene with swollen eyes, approached and also knelt, reaching out to touch the stray's head. Her touch was hesitant, laden with a weight that hadn't existed before. She looked at Ilara, who raised her blue eyes to her mother. There was no accusation in them, only a wisdom that Mrs. Mendez hadn't noticed until now. "You knew, didn't you, darling?" Mrs. Mendez asked, her voice a whisper. "You and Shadow, you always knew." Ilara merely nodded, an almost imperceptible movement of her head, but one that resonated like thunder in her parents' consciousness. That small gesture confirmed everything they had ignored. Shadow's agitation wasn't a behavioral problem, it was a warning. Ilara's singular vision wasn't just a peculiarity, it was a deep, intuitive connection to the world, especially with her dog. Other parents, still trembling from the scare, began to approach, their eyes fixed on Shadow. Whispers about the hero dog began to spread, mixing with the distant sounds of the sirens that were now fading away. Some approached with words of thanks, others just with looks of astonishment and reverence. That stray, who was once just Ilara's dog, or the strange dog, was now the embodiment of courage and instinct. The cold seemed to lessen a bit, replaced by a new understanding that warmed the soul. The Mendez family stood up, their hearts heavy with regret, but overflowing with a gratitude that united them in a new and powerful way. What had happened wasn't just a rescue, it was an awakening. That night, after returning home and ensuring Gabriel was safe in the hospital, warm and recovering, the Mendez house was filled with a different kind of silence. Ilara sat on the living room floor, with Shadow nestled at her feet, his fur dry and soft under her fingers. She didn't speak, but her eyes, which once seemed lost in her own world, now held a gleam of validation, of a truth that had finally been recognized. Mr. and Mrs. Mendez sat on the sofa watching their daughter and the dog. Ilara's therapy sessions, the discussions about Shadow's anxiety, all seemed ridiculous now, superficial. They had sought answers in diagnoses and medications, but the true understanding was there all along, in the unbreakable connection between the girl and her four-legged friend. "We need to change," Mrs. Mendez said, her voice hoarse, breaking the silence. "Everything needs to change." Mr. Mendez nodded, his eyes fixed on Shadow, who raised his head and looked at him with calm intensity. In that moment he saw not just an animal, but a guide, a teacher. That dog had saved a life, and, in the process, had opened their eyes to the truth. They had learned the most painful and important lesson of their lives, that the most powerful voice was not always the loudest, but rather the most instinctive and unwavering, and that sometimes salvation comes in the form of a stray that only a peculiar little girl seemed to understand. Ilara's therapy would no longer be about normalizing her, but rather about understanding and valuing her extraordinary sensitivity and the connection she shared with Shadow. Ilara's world, and theirs, would never be the same. The quiet that settled in the Mendez house after returning from the hospital was different from anything they had experienced. It wasn't the heavy silence of frustration or the emptiness of incomprehension, but a quiet filled with reflection and a new, albeit painful, clarity. Ilara sat on the living room rug, Shadow nestled at her feet, his body still trembling slightly from the adventure on the ice, but his eyes fixed on the girl, as always. The parents watched, their hearts heavy, but in a different way. She was right all along, Mrs. Mendez murmured, her voice almost inaudible, breaking the silence that seemed to have lasted an eternity. She looked at her husband, her eyes welling up with unshed tears. And we made her feel like she was wrong. Mr. Mendez nodded, his throat dry. He felt as if he had been hit by a cold wave, not from the lake, but from the harsh truth. We were so worried about fixing what we thought was broken that we didn't see the strength, the intuition that was always there. He stood up and walked slowly to where Ilara and Shadow were. He knelt, reaching out to stroke Shadow's fur. The dog, who was once a source of anxiety and concern, was now a beacon of undeniable truth. Shadow licked his hand, a gesture of silent forgiveness. "The therapy," Mrs. Mendez continued, her voice gaining a tone of determination. "We can't continue with the same therapist, with the same approach. We can no longer try to make her normal." The next day, Mr. Mendez made the call. Dr. Costa, Ilara's therapist, listened patiently as he described the events of the previous day. Shadow's agitation, Ilara's desperation, the miraculous rescue, and the revelation that the dog had been the guide. There was a long silence on the phone. "Mr. Mendez," Dr. Costa finally said, her voice softer than usual. I understand. Perhaps we need to reevaluate Ilara's perception, her connection with Shadow. That's something we need to explore, not suppress." The news of the hero dog of Springwood spread like wildfire through the town. Neighbors knocked on their door, not to complain about Shadow's barking, but to express gratitude and admiration. Children who once avoided Ilara and her dog now looked at Shadow with reverence and at Ilara with respectful curiosity. The stray who had been marginalized was now the central figure of a local legend, a living testament to the power of instinct. Ilara, oblivious to the external commotion, continued to interact with Shadow in the same way, but there was a subtle difference, her parents now observed. They saw how Shadow tilted his head when Ilara whispered, how he responded to almost imperceptible gestures, how their eyes communicated in a language only they seemed to understand. One afternoon, a few days after the incident, Ilara was sitting in the backyard with Shadow, who whined softly at a bush. Mr. Mendez, who was pruning a tree, would have previously ignored or reprimanded the dog, but now he approached, curious. "What is it, Shadow?" he asked, his voice gentle. Shadow barked once, pointing his snout at the bush, then looked at Ilara. Ilara leaned in, stroking the dog. "He says there's a little bird stuck," she explained, her voice low and clear, "that it's hurt and can't fly." Mr. Mendez, incredulous but now inclined to believe, went to check. Carefully, he parted the branches, and to his surprise, there was a small bird fledgling with a clearly injured wing, weakly struggling in the tangle of branches. A shiver ran down his spine. He had passed that bush dozens of times in the last few days and hadn't noticed anything. Gently, he rescued the fledgling, bringing it inside. Mrs. Mendez, equally shocked, provided a warm and safe place for the bird, and Ilara and Shadow watched the scene with solemn seriousness. That small incident, less dramatic than the lake rescue, but equally revealing, solidified the new reality in the Mendez home. Ilara's singular vision was not a burden, but a gift, and Shadow was not just a pet, he was a bridge to a world of perceptions they were only beginning to unravel. The next therapy session with Dr. Costa was a turning point. Ilara's parents sat together with Dr. Costa while Ilara and Shadow played in an adjacent room, observed through a window. "We can no longer ignore what we've seen," Mrs. Mendez said, her hands clasped. "Ilara doesn't need to be cured of her sensitivity. She needs to be understood, and her connection with Shadow valued." Dr. Costa, with a thoughtful expression, nodded. "I completely agree. My focus will now be on how we can help Ilara navigate this world with her unique sensitivity, and how you, as parents, can learn to listen to her and to Shadow in a way that wasn't possible before. It's not about normalizing, but about empowering." Mr. Mendez felt a weight lifted from his shoulders, a weight he hadn't known he was carrying. He looked at his daughter, whose blue eyes sparkled as she threw a ball for Shadow. The dog's joyful bark echoed through the room, a sound that before might have been a source of frustration, but now sounded like the melody of truth. They had found not only a purpose for Ilara, but a new way of seeing the world, a world where the voice of instinct, the intuition of a child, and the loyalty of a dog were invaluable guides. The winter of Springwood, which had been so brutal, now seemed to have brought with it a new spring of understanding and acceptance. The quiet that had settled in the Mendez house, once a burden, gradually transformed into a space for listening. The silence, previously filled with unspoken doubts and frustrations, now echoed with the promise of a new understanding. Winter, which had brought ice and terror, now unveiled the spring of acceptance, not only for Ilara, but for the entire family. The first meeting with Dr. Costa after the lake incident was different from all previous ones. The therapy room, which once seemed like a courtroom where Ilara's and Shadow's behavior was dissected and judged, now resembled a laboratory of discoveries. Ilara wasn't sitting rigidly in the chair, but playing freely on the floor with Shadow, building colorful blocks, while the dog, with his snout resting on her legs, watched her every move. The parents, seated opposite Dr. Costa, observed the scene through a glass wall, their gazes now devoid of anguish, replaced by attentive curiosity. "We will no longer focus on correcting Ilara," Dr. Costa began, her voice soft but firm. "Our goal is to understand how she perceives the world, how Shadow fits into that, and how you can connect with this unique reality." Mrs. Mendez nodded, feeling a knot untie in her chest. "We want to learn to listen to them," she said, her voice choked. "Truly listen to them." Dr. Costa suggested a simple exercise. Observe Ilara and Shadow without intervention, recording every interaction, every subtle gesture, every sound Shadow made. The parents dedicated themselves to the task with a seriousness they had never shown before. They saw Shadow wag his tail at a specific rhythm when Ilara was about to knock over a block tower, and Ilara, in response, reach out to stabilize it. They saw Shadow emit a low, soft growl when Ilara seemed confused, and the girl, as if understanding a secret language, changed the way she held a block. There were no words, but the communication was undeniable, fluid, and profound. At home, the change was even more palpable. Mr. Mendez, who used to reprimand Shadow for barking excessively at the neighbor's yard, now approached, trying to understand what the dog was indicating. One morning, Shadow barked persistently towards the back fence. Ilara, who was drawing, looked up. "He says the neighbor's faucet is dripping," she whispered, "and that he's worried about the waste." Mr. Mendez, initially skeptical, but now compelled by the new trust in Ilara and Shadow, went to check. Indeed, the neighbor's garden faucet was open, gushing water onto the frozen grass. He knocked on the door, alerted the neighbor, who thanked him, surprised, A small incident, perhaps, but for the Mendes family, it was further irrefutable proof that Shadow's intuition and Ilara's sensitivity were beacons. The news of the hero dog continued to circulate in Springwood, but in a more mature way. The children at Ilara's school, once distant, now sought her out during recess. "Did Shadow say it's going to rain today?" a boy asked, his eyes wide. Ilara, once withdrawn, now smiled slightly and answered with the naturalness of someone sharing a valuable secret. Her parents observed these interactions from afar. Their hearts warmed. Ilara was not being accepted for her strangeness, but rather valued for her uniqueness. In sessions with Dr. Costa, the conversation flowed with impressive ease. "Ilara doesn't just perceive the world, she feels it in a way most of us have unlearned," Dr. Costa explained. "Our job now is to help her translate these sensations so she can communicate even more effectively, and so you can continue to expand your own capacity for listening." Dr. Costa suggested that the parents begin to record not only what Shadow and Ilara indicated, but also the sensations they themselves felt moments before, such as a slight shiver, a premonition, or an almost inaudible sound. The idea was that by tuning into their own intuition, they could begin to better understand the source of Ilara's and Shadow's perception. Mrs. Mendes began taking notes in a small notebook. She noticed that before Shadow barked at a cat on the roof, she felt a slight tingling in her fingertips. Mr. Mendes realized that when Ilara pointed to an injured bird, he felt a tightness in his chest, an immediate empathy. These were small things, but they were links, bridges built between the visible and the invisible world. The Mendes home, once a place of worry and search for answers, had transformed into a center of discoveries. Winter, which had brought fright and re-evaluation, now gave way to a spring of continuous learning. Each day, Ilara and Shadow guided them along a less-traveled path, unveiling layers of reality that most people would never dream existed. And the Mendes family was, finally, ready to walk that path, one step at a time. Spring unfolded over Springwood, painting the landscape with vibrant shades of green and the sweet scent of blossoming flowers. In the Mendes home, the melody of acceptance deepened, and the daily practice of deciphering the signs of the invisible world had become an intrinsic part of their lives. Mrs. Mendes' small notebook was filled with notes about the subtle tingles in her fingers or the slight pressure in her chest that preceded Ilara's and Shadow's revelations. Mr. Mendes, in turn, began to notice the breeze on his skin as a premonition or the specific tone of a bird's chirp as a silent warning. Ilara, with her deep blue eyes now filled with a serene light, spoke with a clarity that was once rare. Her whispers were like threads of gold, connecting the visible to the invisible. Shadow, calmer but still vigilant, guided the family with his constant presence, his barks and growls now understood as a rich and complex language. The town buzzed with preparations for the Spring Festival, an annual event celebrating nature's renewal in the municipal park. Colorful stalls were being set up, and a stage for musical performances was being erected near the small river that meandered through the park, flowing into the lake. An old wooden bridge, affectionately called Whispering Bridge by the children, was one of the most popular crossings to reach the main festival area. Shadow, during a morning walk in the park, began to exhibit strange behavior. Instead of running freely, he stopped abruptly at the entrance to Whispering Bridge. His fur bristled slightly, and he let out a low, almost inaudible growl that vibrated in the air. Then he began to scratch the first wooden plank with his paws, a scraping, repetitive sound. Ilara approached, observing the dog with silent intensity. "He says the river is angry," Ilara whispered to her parents, who had come closer. "And the bridge is tired. It won't hold the melody of so many people." Mrs. Mendes felt a shiver run down her spine. Mr. Mendez, who initially looked at the bridge, which seemed perfectly stable, felt a slight tightness in his stomach. The river, though calm on the surface, gurgled with more force beneath the bridge's pillars, a low, continuous sound. "Tired?" Mr. Mendez asked, crouching down to inspect the wood. There were no obvious cracks, no loose planks, but the smell of dampness was stronger there, and the wood seemed a little darker, as if it had absorbed too much water. "He says the bridge's heart is soft," Elara explained, pointing to a specific spot under the structure, where the flowing water hit with a hollow sound, "and the people's music will make it cry." Elara's parents, without hesitation, decided to trust. Mr. Mendez, with a closer look, noticed that one of the supporting pillars, though covered by water, seemed to have a slightly corroded section at its base, invisible to a casual inspection. The force of the spring river, fed by melting snow, was indeed exerting continuous pressure there. Back home, Mr. Mendez called the town council, describing Shadow's behavior and Elara's interpretation. At first, there was a tone of skepticism on the other end of the line. "Whispering Bridge was inspected in the fall, Mr. Mendez. It's perfectly safe." "With all due respect," Mr. Mendez insisted, his voice firm, "Shadow has already proven that his intuition is something to be taken seriously. And Elara, she has a way of seeing things that we're only just beginning to understand." He mentioned the lake incident and the fence incident, the undeniable evidence. The next day, a park maintenance team was sent for a more thorough inspection. They used underwater equipment and, to everyone's surprise, confirmed Elara's words. One of the pillars of Whispering Bridge was significantly compromised by erosion and dampness, making it dangerous under the weight of a crowd. If the festival had proceeded as planned, the bridge could have collapsed. The news spread like a murmur through the town council and the town. The festival was temporarily rerouted, and Whispering Bridge was closed for urgent repairs. Shadow, Super Shadow, had once again averted a potential tragedy, and Elara, the girl who translated his whispers, was viewed with even greater admiration. In sessions with Dr. Costa, the family reported the bridge incident. "Elara and Shadow don't just see what is, but what could be," Dr. Costa summarized, her smile warm. "And you, parents, are becoming the bridge between their gift and the world around them. You are learning to translate not just words, but sensations and premonitions." Elara, who used to avoid eye contact, now looked directly at Dr. Costa, her eyes expressing a deep understanding. She didn't need many words. The validation in her eyes was enough. The Mendez family, now more than ever, felt they were on the right path, a path where intuition was the light and understanding, the destination. They were ready for the next layer of reality that Springwood and life would present to them. The Spring Festival, rerouted to an older, vaster section of Municipal Park, pulsed with renewed life. Children's laughter mingled with the vibrant strumming of guitars on the makeshift stage, and the aroma of cotton candy drifted through the air. Colorful stalls offered local crafts and treats, attracting families strolling under the soft spring sunlight. Elara, with Shadow by her side, walked hand in hand with her parents, absorbing the contagious joy. She was no longer hiding behind her mother's legs. Her blue eyes observed the scene with serene curiosity, and she smiled openly when a colorful butterfly flew nearby. As they approached a less crowded clearing, surrounded by ancient oak trees and a small forgotten pond, Shadow's behavior changed. His steps slowed. His tail, which had been gently wagging, now hung low. He sniffed the ground intensely, his whiskers vibrating, and an almost inaudible growl escaped his throat. A low sound that seemed more like a vibrant hum. Then, He began to scratch the damp earth with one of his front paws, a rhythmic scraping that seemed to want to unearth something invisible. The sound was persistent, a subtle warning amidst the festival's hubbub. "The earth is thirsty, Mom," Ilara whispered, pointing to the ground where Shadow was scratching. "And the water is sad. It doesn't want to sing." Mrs. Mendes felt an uncomfortable tingling in her fingertips, a sensation of coldness that crept up her arms despite the day's warmth. A subtle, almost metallic smell touched her nostrils, mingling with the scent of flowers. Mr. Mendes felt a tightness in his chest, a pang of unease. He looked at the small pond, whose surface seemed strangely still, reflecting the clouds in an opaque way. The banks, covered in low vegetation, seemed to have a slightly darker color, a grayish green that contrasted with the vibrant green of the rest of the park. "Thirsty and sad?" Mr. Mendes asked, crouching near Shadow. He touched the earth, which felt colder than usual. "Are you sure, honey?" Ilara nodded vigorously. "The earth is crying," she explained, her voice low and serious, "and the water is choking. It can't breathe." The parents exchanged glances. There was no skepticism in their eyes, only the urgency to understand and act. The series of recent events had cemented their trust. Mr. Mendes pulled his phone from his pocket. "I'll call the council again," he said, his voice firm. "Tell them Shadow and Ilara have a new message." Mrs. Mendes picked up her small notebook, recording her sensations. The tingling, the metallic smell, the coldness of the earth. This time the council's response was immediate and unequivocal. The reputation of Super Shadow and the girl who whispers to the earth had preceded the call. Within a few hours, a small team of environmental technicians arrived at the site with soil and water testing equipment. While the festival continued in other areas of the park, they focused on the isolated clearing. The sound of measuring instruments filled the silence of that corner of the park, a mechanical click and a faint hum from the sensors. To the team's surprise and the Mendes family's validation, tests revealed the presence of small concentrations of an old herbicide, likely remnants of decades-old pest management, which had been buried and was now, with increased foot traffic and spring moisture, beginning to percolate to the surface and the small pond. It wasn't an immediate health threat, but it could cause irritation and, in the long term, affect local flora and fauna. The area was promptly isolated to begin the remediation process. The town council issued a statement publicly thanking the Mendes family and their keen senses. The news spread through Springwood, and admiration for Ilara's and Shadow's connection deepened, transforming into a reverence for their ability to feel the invisible pulse of the world. In the next session with Dr. Costa, the story of the sad earth and water was told. "Ilara and Shadow don't just protect us from visible danger," Dr. Costa pondered, her eyes soft and understanding. "They teach us to listen to the earth itself, to understand its health and its laments. Ilara's gift is a compass for harmony, and you, parents, are the navigators, learning to read the stars she points to." Ilara, sitting between her parents, held Shadow's paw, her eyes fixed on Dr. Costa, a small, satisfied smile playing on her lips. The Mendes family's journey continued, each revelation a step forward into a world where the invisible became the clearest of truths. Springwood was now preparing for the traditional Heritage Fair, an annual event celebrating the town's history and culture in the old community hall. The building, with its time-worn stone walls and red-tiled roof, was a beloved landmark, the stage for generations of festivities. The entire town buzzed with anticipation for homemade sweets, folk dances, and stories told by the elders. Ilara, Shadow, and her parents strolled through Central Square, where the hall stood imposing. There was a murmur of animated voices as volunteers began preparations, carrying boxes of decorations and folding tables into the hall. The melody of an accordion being tuned echoed from inside. Shadow, who until then had walked with a tranquil gait, stopped abruptly before the double wooden doors of the community hall. His fur bristled, not aggressively, but with a subtle tension, and a low growl, almost a deep hum, vibrated in his chest. He sniffed the air with unusual intensity, his eyes fixed on the old stone facade. Then he began to scratch the damp earth near the base of the wall, a persistent scraping that seemed to want to unearth the very stone. "He says the house has a headache, Dad," Ilara whispered, pointing to the wall where Shadow was scratching. Her eyes, which had previously sparkled with festival joy, now carried a shadow of concern. "The stones have a fever, and the floor will sigh with tiredness if too many people jump." Mrs. Mendez felt an icy shiver run down her spine, even under the mild spring sun. A peculiar smell of mold and damp earth mixed with something reminiscent of old. Crushed dust floated in the air around the hall, imperceptible to most. Mr. Mendez, crouching beside Shadow, touched the base of the wall. The stone felt cold and damp, and he felt an almost imperceptible vibration, a constant tremor that seemed to come from within the structure. "Headache? Fever?" Mr. Mendez repeated, his eyes sweeping over the imposing building, which at first glance seemed as solid as a mountain. He noticed that the joints between some of the stones, though ancient, seemed a little darker, as if there was continuous infiltration. "Are you sure, my dear?" Ilara nodded vigorously, her expression serious. "The house's heart is beating weakly. It can't handle the joy of so many people. It will collapse with the music." Ilara's parents didn't hesitate. The series of recent validations had transformed any lingering skepticism into an unwavering conviction. Mr. Mendez quickly pulled his phone from his pocket. "I'll call the council. We can't risk it." This time, the town council's response was immediate and alarmed. Shadow's and Ilara's reputation had spread throughout Springwood. In less than an hour, a team of structural engineers arrived at the site with ultrasound equipment and moisture detectors. While volunteers were gently evacuated, the sound of measuring instruments filled the air. A dry click, a sharp hum, followed by an electronic whistle. To the team's astonishment and the Mendez family's silent validation, tests revealed the presence of extensive hidden structural damage. Old and continuous infiltration had compromised the stone foundations on one side of the hall, and wooden beams in the roof, weakened by termites and dampness, were dangerously fragile. The weight and vibration of a crowd during the festival could have caused a partial collapse. The area was promptly isolated, and the community hall was closed for urgent repairs. The Heritage Fair was relocated to the football field, an open and safe space. The town council issued a public statement, once again thanking the Mendez family and the extraordinary ability of its members to feel the soul of the town. The news spread, and admiration for Ilara's and Shadow's connection to the heart of Springwood deepened, transforming into an almost mystical reverence. Dr. Costa, the story of the headache house, was told. "Ilara and Shadow don't just protect us from visible or environmental danger," Dr. Costa pondered, her gaze warm. "They teach us to listen to the very structure of the world around us, to understand the health of the things we build and value. Ilara's gift is a melody for harmony, and you, parents, are the orchestra, learning to play the symphony she hears." Ilara, sitting on the soft rug, drew something in her notebook, her eyes fixed on Dr. Costa. A small smile formed on her lips as Shadow, lying at her feet, let out a satisfied sigh, as if all of Springwood could finally breathe safely. The confidence Ilara felt, mirrored in Shadow's satisfied sigh, permeated Springwood. The town, grateful and increasingly attentive, was preparing to celebrate another milestone, the inauguration of the Springwood Water Purification Center, a modern facility that promised even cleaner and purer water for all its inhabitants. Pride overflowed in every conversation at the bakery, in every smile exchanged on Main Street. The Mendez family, with Ilara and Shadow, had been invited as guests of honor, a public recognition that warmed Ilara's heart. It was a sunny day, the fresh spring air carrying the scent of newly opened flowers. The new purification center stood, gleaming, with its glass and steel walls reflecting the blue sky. The entrance was decorated with blue and white ribbons, the town's colors, and a makeshift stage awaited the authorities' speeches. The buzz of animated voices filled the courtyard as citizens gathered, curious and hopeful. The soft purr of the machines, an almost inaudible sound in the distance, seemed to promise efficiency and progress. Ilara, holding her mother's hand, walked beside Shadow, who followed with his tail gently wagging. Mr. Mendez, proud, gently nudged Ilara forward, encouraging her to interact. The mayor of Springwood, a man with a deep voice and an easy smile, greeted them personally, shaking Mr. and Mrs. Mendez's hands and petting Shadow's head, who reciprocated with a tail wag. "Without you, who knows what other secrets our town would be keeping," the mayor commented with a laugh. But there was a serious undertone in his eyes. As the family approached the internal visitation area, where complex chrome steel pipes intertwined and gigantic filtration tanks displayed the gleam of transparent water, Shadow's behavior changed. His steps, once light, became heavy. His tail dropped, glued to his body. He began to sniff the air with unusual intensity, his whiskers vibrating. A low, guttural growl escaped his chest, a sound that seemed to scrape the inner walls of his throat, more a muffled lament than an aggressive warning. Shadow pushed his snout against one of the main water inlet pipes, which seemed perfectly sealed and clean, and let out a short, sharp bark, which echoed strangely in the industrial space. Then he began to scratch the polished cement floor with his front paw near the base of that same pipe, a harsh and repetitive sound. "The water has a stomachache, Dad," Ilara whispered, her eyes fixed on the pipe where Shadow was agitated. Her voice, once full of curiosity, now carried a note of anguish. "It can't clean itself properly, and the machine. Its heart is tired of coughing so much." Mrs. Mendez felt a shiver run down her spine, a metallic taste in her mouth, as if she had bitten a rusty coin, despite no unusual taste in the air. A subtle smell of something damp and old, reminiscent of moss and wet earth, but mingling with the aseptic scent of the environment, floated in her nostrils. Mr. Mendez, crouching beside Shadow, touched the pipe. The metal was cold, as expected, but he noticed a strange, almost imperceptible vibration, different from the constant hum of the machinery. "Stomachache, coughing," Mr. Mendez repeated, his eyes scanning the impeccable piping, which seemed perfect in every detail. He noticed a tiny, almost invisible spot at the joint of one of the pipe sections, a spot that seemed slightly more opaque, an almost imperceptible smudge that could just be a reflection. "What it's drinking isn't good. It will make everyone sick slowly, slowly." The confidence in them was absolute. Mr. Mendez quickly pulled his phone from his pocket and dialed the mayor's number, who was about to begin his speech. The center's engineering team, who were accompanying the visit, were immediately alerted. In a few minutes, the buzz of the inauguration was replaced by an apprehensive silence and the sound of technicians rushing with their equipment. A hydraulic systems specialist, a man with glasses and grey hair, approached the pipe pointed out by Shadow. He turned on a high-frequency ultrasound device which emitted a sharp, almost imperceptible hum to the human ear, followed by a rhythmic click. The device's digital display began to flash, showing inconsistent readings. To the team's astonishment and the Mendez family's silent validation, tests revealed the presence of a capillary microfissure in one of the newly installed high-pressure filtration membranes. The fissure was so tiny it hadn't been detected by routine post-installation tests, but it was enough to allow small concentrations of a mineral compound present in the raw water to pass without being completely retained. In single doses, it would be harmless, but accumulation over time could cause kidney and liver problems in the population. Furthermore, the failure was causing a small pressure instability that, if not corrected, could lead to a larger rupture. The inauguration was interrupted. The purification center was temporarily deactivated for urgent repairs and a complete review of the new filters. The mayor stepped onto the makeshift stage, not to give a celebratory speech, but to issue a public statement. With a voice filled with gratitude and a touch of humility, he thanked the Mendez family and, in particular, Ilara, the girl who hears what the water whispers, and Shadow, the dog who senses illness before it even manifests. The story spread like ripples in the lake, and admiration for Ilara's and Shadow's connection to Springwood's vital pulse deepened even further, elevating them to true guardians of the town. Dr. Costa, the story of the water with a stomachache, was told. Ilara and Shadow don't just protect us from visible environmental, structural, or technological danger, Dr. Costa pondered, her gaze deep and serene. They teach us to listen to the very breath of the technology we build, to understand the health of our innovations. Ilara's gift is a melody for harmony in all its forms, and you, parents, are the maestros, learning to conduct the symphony she reveals to us. Ilara, sitting on a small ottoman in the office, stroked Shadow's fur, who was dozing deeply at her feet. A slight smile of understanding lit up her face as she watched Dr. Costa. For Ilara, the water had never lied, and now everyone in Springwood was learning to listen to its truth. Springwood breathed an air of renewal. The series of challenges overcome, each with Ilara's and Shadow's crucial intervention, had instilled in the community a new form of self-awareness. It wasn't just gratitude, but a reverence for the ability to feel the hidden dangers the town possessed. In one of the town council meetings, the construction of a new landmark for the town was proposed, a majestic and imposing bell tower, which would not only mark time, but also symbolize Springwood's resilience and unity. The tower would be a beacon of hope, a monument to the ability to listen and learn. The Mendez family, of course, was invited to the groundbreaking ceremony. The morning sun bathed the central square, where the tower would be erected, and the excitement was palpable. Colorful banners fluttered in the gentle breeze, and the music of a municipal band filled the air with joyful melodies. Ilara, holding her mother's hand, felt the crowd's enthusiasm like a warm wave, but beneath that surface, a dissonant note vibrated. Shadow, by her side, did not share in the general joy. His steps were heavy, and a subtle, almost inaudible growl escaped his chest as he sniffed the ground where the first shovel of earth would be turned. His tail, usually in constant motion, was low, and his eyes, fixed on the ground, seemed to see something no one else could. He scratched the earth with his front paw, a dry, persistent sound. "Dad, the earth has bone pain," Ilara whispered, pointing to the ground with a small, serious finger. Her voice carried a tone of concern, contrasting with the festive buzz. "It's vibrating in a strange way, like when you have a fever and feel everything shaking inside. Its heart is weak. It can't support such a large tower." Mrs. Mendez felt a tingling in her feet, a sensation that the ground wasn't as solid as it seemed, although visually everything was perfect. Mr. Mendez, crouching beside Shadow, felt a subtle vibration in the ground, but attributed it to the band's sound equipment. However, Ilara's gaze and Shadow's behavior were unmistakable. Without hesitation, Mr. Mendez pulled the mayor aside, his voice grave and urgent. "Mayor, Ilara and Shadow are signaling a problem with the ground. They say the earth has bone pain." The mayor, whose easy laugh had vanished, nodded seriously. Their trust in them was unwavering. Immediately he asked for the ceremony to be paused, and the geotechnical engineering team, already present to supervise the project, was alerted. In a few minutes, the sound of shovels and picks gave way to the hum of soil prospecting equipment. A white-haired geologist with thin glasses, accompanied by his team, began collecting samples and operating underground anomaly detectors. The dry click of the sonar devices penetrated the earth, and the display of a portable seismograph began to show irregular patterns. To the team's astonishment and the Mendes family's silent validation, tests revealed the presence of an old but active geological fault that crossed the exact point where the tower's main foundation would be built. The fault, imperceptible on the surface, made the location dangerously unstable for such a heavy structure, especially in case of seismic tremors, however rare they might be in the region. Furthermore, a layer of expansive clay, which would become unstable with variations in humidity, was detected at depths that could compromise long-term stability. The construction of the bell tower was immediately halted. The project was reviewed, and after extensive studies, a new location, a few dozen meters away, was chosen on rocky and stable ground. The mayor stepped onto the makeshift stage, not to lay the cornerstone, but to issue a public statement. With a voice choked with gratitude and deep respect, he thanked the Mendes family and, in particular, Ilara, the girl who feels the pulse of the earth, and Shadow, the dog who hears the whispers of the subsoil. The news spread, and admiration for Ilara's and Shadow's connection to the heart of Springwood itself reached a level of reverence that bordered on the mystical. They were not just guardians, they were the true listeners of the town's soul, from its waters to its foundations. Dr. Costa, the story of the earth with bone pain, was told. Ilara and Shadow don't just protect us from visible environmental, structural, technological, or geological danger, Dr. Costa pondered, her eyes filled with deep understanding. They teach us to listen to the very foundation of the world we live in, to understand the health of the earth beneath our feet. Ilara's gift is a melody for harmony in all its manifestations, and you, parents, are the conductors, learning to interpret the symphony she hears in the innermost part of everything. Ilara, nestled on a plush rug, hugged Shadow, who let out a soft purr. She felt the vibration of the ground through the dog's body, a vibration that now seemed calm and at peace. For Ilara, the earth had never lied, and now everyone in Springwood was learning to respect its truth, to trust those who listened to it. Springwood's trust in Ilara and Shadow was now an unshakable foundation, more solid than any rock. The bell tower, relocated, began to rise in its new spot, and with every hammer blow and every beam lifted, the town felt renewed pride, a sense that it was finally learning to listen. Modernization, however, did not stop. The town council, driven by a vision of a future Springwood, approved an ambitious public lighting project. Old lamps would be replaced by a network of state-of-the-art LED luminaires, promising safer streets, lower energy consumption, and a renewed urban aesthetic. The inauguration ceremony for the first phase of the new lighting was a spectacle of light and sound. At dusk, in the heart of the central square, the mayor pressed a button, and with a soft electrical click, a wave of bright white light flooded the area. People exclaimed in admiration, their eyes reflecting the new splendor. The municipal band played a vibrant melody, and joyful laughter echoed into the night. But for Ilara, who watched hand in hand with her mother, the light was not a soft embrace, but an assault. Her eyes widened, and she pulled her mother's hand forcefully. "Mummy, the light is screaming," Ilara whispered, her voice tense and full of anguish. "It makes a tiny noise that tears inside, and it trembles, trembles, trembles. It makes my head hurt like it wants to explode." Shadow, by her side, did not bark, but let out a low, continuous growl. His ears flattened and his eyes narrowed. He began to back away, pulling hard on his leash, trying to get away from the illuminated square. His fur bristled slightly. To the parents, the light seemed perfectly normal, even beautiful. The intense white seemed clean and efficient. However, Ilara's and Shadow's reaction was unmistakable. Mrs. Mendez felt a pang of concern, a tightness in her chest she knew well. Mr. Mendez, without hesitation, picked Ilara up and approached one of the new poles. He tried to feel for any vibration, any excessive heat, but perceived nothing beyond the intense brightness. However, Ilara's discomfort was evident, and Shadow cowered in her father's arms, letting out small whimpers that were almost lost in the hubbub of the party. "Mayor, Ilara and Shadow are signaling a problem with the new lights," Mr. Mendez said, his voice grave as he approached the municipal head. "Ilara says the light screams and trembles, causing her head to hurt, and Shadow is terrified." The mayor, who moments before radiated joy, paled. His easy laugh vanished, replaced by a serious and concentrated expression. Immediately, he asked for the celebration to be gently concluded, and the team of electrical engineers and lighting specialists who were overseeing the project was alerted. In a few minutes, the sound of the band and laughter were replaced by the soft hum of testing equipment. A lighting engineer, a man with dark glasses and a powerful flashlight, began operating a portable spectrometer, which emitted a rhythmic click as it analyzed the light spectrum. A flicker detection device with a small digital display began to flash inconsistent numbers. To the team's astonishment and the Mendez family's silent validation, tests revealed that, although the lamps were energy efficient and powerful, they emitted a high-frequency flicker, imperceptible to most human eyes, but which could cause visual fatigue, headaches, and in more sensitive individuals, sleep cycle disturbances. Furthermore, the light spectrum was excessively rich in blue tones, a characteristic that, with prolonged exposure at night, could suppress melatonin production, impacting long-term health. The tiny hum Ilara heard was a sensory manifestation of the electromagnetic field associated with current oscillation, and the tremor was the perception of the micro-oscillation of brightness that her unique eyes captured. The installation of the new lighting was immediately halted. The project was reviewed, and after extensive studies and consultations with photobiology specialists, the City Council opted for a new type of LED with a warmer spectrum and flicker-free technology, which did not cause the harmful oscillations. The already installed lamps were quickly replaced, and a system for adjusting light intensity was implemented for nighttime hours. The mayor stepped onto the makeshift stage, not to celebrate the brightness, but to issue a public statement. With a voice choked with gratitude and deep respect, he thanked the Mendez family and, in particular, Ilara, the girl who hears the silence of light, and Shadow, the dog who senses what eyes cannot see. The news spread, and admiration for Ilara's and Shadow's connection to Springwood's sensory pulse reached a level of reverence that bordered on the extraordinary. They were not just guardians, they were the true tuners of the town's harmony, from its waters and foundations to the very light that bathed it. Dr. Costa, the story of the screaming light was told. Ilara and Shadow don't just protect us from visible, environmental, structural, technological, geological, or luminous danger, Dr. Costa pondered, her eyes filled with a profound understanding. They teach us to listen to the very frequencies of the world we live in, to understand the health of the energy that illuminates and moves us. Ilara felt the sunlight entering through the window, a calm, warm light that made no noise. For Ilara, the light had never lied, and now everyone in Springwood was learning to respect its truth, to trust those who listened to it. Springwood's trust in Ilara and Shadow had solidified, becoming as unshakable as the rock beneath the newly built bell tower. The town, however, never stopped dreaming of the future. Driven by a vision of a modern and connected Springwood, the town council approved an ambitious digital infrastructure project. It would be Connected Springwood, a high-speed network that would cover every corner of the town, promising fast and free internet in public spots and paving the way for emerging technologies. The launch ceremony for the first phase of the network was marked by contagious optimism. In the Civic Center, amidst laughter and anticipation, the mayor spoke of progress and unity. Then, with a solemn gesture, he pressed a button on a digital panel. A green light flashed, followed by a hum almost inaudible to most present, but which, in theory, marked the activation of the first long-range transmitters. People applauded, already imagining the speed with which their lives would be transformed. Ilara, holding her mother's hand, felt a strange coldness run down her spine. Her eyes widened, and she pulled her mother's hand with an urgency that Mrs. Mendez already knew well. "Mommy, the air is tight," Ilara whispered, her voice tense and full of anguish. "It vibrates inside, makes a soundless hiss, but it pushes. It feels like it wants to crush everything." Shadow by her side did not bark, but let out a low, continuous growl. His ears flattened and his eyes narrowed. He began to back away, pulling hard on his leash, his fur bristling slightly on his neck, as if he felt an invisible pressure in the environment. To the parents, the air seemed perfectly normal. The same smell of freshly cut grass and a faint aroma of popcorn from a nearby stall. However, Ilara's and Shadow's reaction was unmistakable, an alarm that could not be ignored. Mrs. Mendez felt the familiar tightness in her chest, while Mr. Mendez, without hesitation, picked Ilara up. He tried to feel any difference in the air, any vibration, but perceived only his daughter's growing restlessness and Shadow's soft lament, who cowered, pressing his head against his father's chest. "Mayor? Ilara and Shadow are signaling a problem with the new network," Mr. Mendez said, his voice grave, approaching the municipal head. "Ilara says the air is tight, and she feels a soundless hiss, and Shadow is terrified." The mayor, whose triumphant expression quickly faded, paled. His easy laugh disappeared, replaced by concentrated seriousness. Immediately, he asked for the celebration to be gently concluded, and the team of telecommunications engineers and radio frequency specialists who were overseeing the project was alerted. In a few minutes, the hubbub of the party was replaced by the dry click of testing equipment. A grey-haired engineer with a vest full of pockets began operating a portable spectrum analyzer. The device emitted intermittent beeps as it scanned frequencies, and an electromagnetic field meter with its small digital display began to show readings that, although within accepted regulatory limits, were atypically elevated for a densely populated area. To the team's astonishment, and the Mendez family's silent validation, tests revealed that, although the technology was efficient and powerful, the transmission method and network configuration were creating a diffuse and constant radio frequency field throughout the square. This field, imperceptible to most, was generating a low-intensity resonance that, in more sensitive people and animals, could cause anxiety, irritability, and even disturbances in sensory perception. Ilara's soundless hiss was the manifestation of an electromagnetic field that her unique senses perceived as an unspeakable pressure in the environment, and the tight air was the perception of the invisible energy flooding the space. The activation of Connected Springwood was immediately halted. The project was reviewed, and after extensive studies and consultations with bioelectromagnetism specialists, the City Council opted for a new network architecture with lower power, more distributed and directed transmitters, and the implementation of EMF mitigation technologies in sensitive areas. The already installed equipment was quickly replaced, and a continuous monitoring system for emissions was implemented. The mayor stepped onto the makeshift stage, not to celebrate connectivity, but to issue a public statement. With a voice choked with gratitude and deep respect, he thanked the Mendez family and, in particular, Ilara, the girl who feels the invisible pulse of the town, and Shadow, the dog who hears frequencies that ordinary ears do not perceive. The news spread, and admiration for Ilara's and Shadow's connection to Springwood's energetic heart reached a level of reverence that bordered on the transcendent. They were not just guardians, they were the true tuners of the town's harmony. From its waters, foundations, and light, to the very energy that permeated the air. Dr. Costa, the story of the tight air, was told. Ilara and Shadow don't just protect us from visible, environmental, structural, technological, geological, or luminous danger, Dr. Costa pondered, her eyes filled with a profound understanding. They teach us to listen to the very vibrations of the world we live in, to understand the health of the energy fields that surround us. Ilara felt the air around her, a light and pressure-free air that made no noise and did not constrict. For Ilara, the world's energies had never lied, and now everyone in Springwood was learning to respect its truth, to trust those who listened to it. Months turned into years, and Springwood flourished under a new philosophy of listening. The town, once focused on visible progress, had learned to value the invisible, the inaudible, what only the most sensitive could perceive. Ilara, now a pre-teen with even more curious eyes, and Shadow, her loyal companion with fur already flecked with silver around his snout, were more than local heroes. They were the silent oracles of collective well-being. Trust in them was no longer a reaction to a crisis, but a pillar of Springwood's identity. Annually, the town celebrated the Springwood Harmony Festival, an event born from the understanding that true unity came from a deep attunement to the environment and to one another. That year, anticipation hung in the air with the inauguration of the Wind Symphony, a monumental artistic installation of bells and metallic tubes designed to vibrate with the wind, creating ambient melodies throughout the main square. The artist, a renowned master of sound art, had promised an immersive experience of peace and contemplation. On the day of the inauguration, the sun painted the sky a serene blue. A gentle breeze began to blow, and the bells of the Wind Symphony came to life, emitting a soft metallic chime, followed by a long, resonant bronze hum that spread through the air. People closed their eyes, a relaxed smile on their lips, absorbing the beauty of the wandering melody. Ilara, however, beside her parents and with Shadow nestled at her feet, felt a wave of discomfort invade her chest. Her shoulders hunched slightly. "Mommy, this music, it has a bitter taste," Ilara whispered, her voice constrained by an almost imperceptible pain. "It gets under my skin, makes a soundless hiss that doesn't scream, but laments. It's not beautiful, Mommy. It's crying." Shadow, who had been quiet until then, let out a low whimper, a sound he rarely made. His ears flattened completely, and he began to scratch the ground with a paw, a deep restlessness agitating his body. His eyes, usually alert, were now watery, and he pressed his head against Ilara's thigh, seeking comfort, as if the very harmony others heard was torture for him. The parents, though they heard only the soft, pleasant melody, felt the familiar shiver of urgency. There was no panic in Ilara's voice, but a sadness so profound that it was palpable. Mr. Mendez knelt, hugging his daughter, while Mrs. Mendez stroked Shadow, feeling the anxious vibration of his body. "Mayor," Mr. Mendez called, his voice serious, approaching the municipal head who was smiling, absorbed in the music. "Ilara and Shadow are signaling a problem with the Wind Symphony. Ilara says the music cries and has a bitter taste, and Shadow is deeply distressed." The mayor's smile wavered. The gratitude and trust Springwood placed in Ilara and Shadow were absolute. Immediately, he asked for the installation to be temporarily deactivated. The chiming and humming ceased, and an almost deafening silence descended upon the square. Ilara took a deep breath, and Shadow let out a sigh, visibly relaxing, his eyes returning to their usual liveliness. A team of audiologists and bioacousticians who had already been incorporated into the City Hall staff after the bell tower incident was called. High-precision sound measuring equipment was installed, analyzing sound waves at frequencies beyond the range of human hearing. To the team's astonishment and the Mendez family's silent validation, tests revealed that while the melodies were pleasant in their audible frequencies, the combination of materials and the design of the tubes created a series of subharmonics and infrasounds, very low-frequency sound waves that, though inaudible to most, were perceived by the limbic system of more sensitive beings. These infrasounds generated a sensation of oppression and deep sadness, a vibrational melancholy that echoed in the innermost part of one's being. Ilara's bitter taste was the synesthetic perception of this emotional dissonance, and Shadow's lament, the instinctive resonance with this invisible anguish. The Wind Symphony was immediately modified. After extensive studies and the replacement of materials, the City Council opted for a new design that eliminated the problematic subharmonics, creating a melody that, this time, emanated a true sense of peace and upliftment. The artist, deeply impacted, recognized the dimension of harmony he had never explored. The mayor stepped onto the makeshift stage, not to celebrate the art, but to issue a public statement. With a voice choked with gratitude and deep respect, he thanked the Mendez family, and, in particular, Ilara, the girl who feels the soul of sound, and Shadow, the dog who hears the quietest lament. The news spread, and admiration for Ilara's and Shadow's connection to Springwood's vibrational soul reached a level of reverence that bordered on the sacred. They were not just guardians. They were the true maestros of the town's symphony, from its waters, foundations, light, energy, and now the very sound that filled its skies. Dr. Costa, the story of the crying music, was told. Ilara and Shadow don't just protect us from visible, environmental, structural, technological, geological, luminous, or energetic danger, Dr. Costa pondered, her eyes filled with a comprehension that transcended medicine. They teach us to listen to the very songs of the world we live in, to understand the health of the vibrations that form us, touch us, move us. Ilara's gift is the melody of harmony in all its manifestations, and you, parents, are the conductors, learning to interpret the symphony she hears in the innermost part of everything. Springwood not only thrives, it feels, because it has learned to listen to its most sensitive child and its most loyal dog. Ilara, nestled on a plush rug, hugged Shadow, who let out a deep, satisfied purr. She felt the sound of the world around her, a light and unbitter sound that did not lament but sang. The afternoon sun streamed through the window, painting the room with golden hues. For Ilara, the world had never lied, and now everyone in Springwood was learning to dance to the rhythm of its truth, to trust those who heard the purest and deepest symphony of existence. Springwood, the town that learned to listen, lived in perfect harmony, a vibrant testament to the wisdom that resides in the most singular of perceptions.